Excellent. Okay, well, thank you very much. And thank you to the organizers, Kai, Harris, and Esteris for this wonderful event. And of course, to all the other presenters. I'm going to be speaking today, but Kit and Zach are here as well. And we would all be happy to field questions at the end if you have any. And just to let you know about our respective roles, Kit supervised the data collection for this project in tandem with a couple of others, and Zach established the precedent for this paper with his earlier corpus study and also ran the script for our analysis. We are presenting the early stages of a study on orchestration semantics. So we are very lucky that the great session yesterday on timbre semantics reminded everybody of many of the relevant concepts and contexts. And I also think it's very nice to have one talk about orchestration syntax and then a talk about orchestration semantics right after. So kudos to the conference organizers. So just to briefly recap, in timbre semantics, we are concerned with the study of cognitive linguistic bases for experiences of timbre, including its affective, cross-modal, and other extramusical associations. We are interested in the descriptive words that people use to account for timbre, as when orchestration pedagogue Samuel Adler, for example, describes the sound of the horn as mellow or velvet-like. Many publications have addressed this broad subject in recent years, and we are fortunate that many of the leading researchers are participating in this conference, and perhaps some of them are here for this talk. Timbre semantics is still a relatively young field, which may be related to the longstanding assumption in some strains of music scholarship that semantic interpretations are arbitrary. But thanks to the work of many innovative researchers, there is now a substantial and growing body of empirical evidence to refute such skepticism, supporting a high degree of intersubjective consistency in at least some aspects of timbre semantics. As was noted yesterday, most studies in timbre semantics focus on isolated timbres, especially the sounds of musical instruments. Though as we heard, there are also some very interesting forays into other sound worlds, such as synthetic timbres and animal sounds. In this study, we remain interested in instrumental timbres, but we note that the musical contexts in which they are experienced are more often worlds of combination rather than isolated monochromic sound worlds. Music, especially ensemble music, frequently involves augmented timbres, emergent timbres, integrated textures, and other effects resulting from combinations of instruments. These composite timbres may also give rise to semantic interpretation, as when Adler uses words such as bombastic, tiresome, powerful, and majestic to describe the brass family in different contexts. And so our research question is, how do the semantics of instrumental combinations compare with the semantics of individual instruments? We draw heavily on Zach's great corpus study of instrument descriptions in orchestration treatises and textbooks, which I'm sure many of you know. Orchestration books provide a very rich source of information about timbre semantics for both individual instruments and in instrumental combinations. Zach's study focused on descriptors for individual instruments in a corpus of 11 books, analyzing the frequency with which terms appear, grouping them into categories reflecting timbre conceptualization and cognition, and applying a principal component analysis to reveal 3 latent dimensions that he called material, sensory, and activity. We decided to revisit the same set of books, following similar methods, but looking at the descriptions of composite timbres instead of individual timbres. But it turns out that it's a lot of work to go through an orchestration textbook and catalog every single description of instrumental combinations. So we're still working through the corpus. At this point, we have data for 6 of the 11 books, the ones that you see listed on this slide. We would like to very much thank the Actor Project and Stephen McAdams, its fearless leader, which not only funded the postdoc I held when we initiated this study, but also provided funding for our research assistants, Rachel Hoddle and Michelle Nadon-Belongi, who spent many, many, many hours collecting and entering data for us. I include a shot of the Excel sheet at the bottom there, just to show you how many columns they needed to populate for each entry, and this might give you some sense of the scope of the work involved. Information for each entry included, but was not limited to, descriptive terms used, instruments involved, number of instrument families, the original quotation, the publication information, and the author, and so on and so on. Where possible, each entry was also cataloged according to the orchestral effects taxonomy, which includes categories like augmented timbre, emergent timbre, and textural integration, which I mentioned a few minutes ago. It is a very elaborate taxonomy, and we do not have time to look at it. Oh. Okay, I was just asked to restart my video, so I hope we didn't miss too much, but Lindsay, feel free to tell me to repeat something if there was a gap.
Oh, okay, I didn't notice anything.
Okay, all right, let's just let that go into the ether. The orchestral effects taxonomy is a very elaborate taxonomy, and we don't have time to look at it in detail right now, but if you have any questions, we'd be happy to address them at the end, and I encourage all of you to look into it if orchestration is your cup of tea. Here, and what's going on now? There we go. Here, we would like to stress that this is very much a work in progress, and that more data and a much more detailed statistical analysis is forthcoming. But for now, we can provide some descriptive statistics after running a filter in R to identify all entries with a number of instruments greater than 1 or unspecified number of instruments. This yielded 1,288 tokens of 545 types, with a type to token ratio of 0.42. And if you're unfamiliar with that measure, as I was at the beginning of this project, type to token ratio is a measure of lexical diversity on a scale of 0 to 1. So here's a word cloud with our top 43 types from this corpus, each of which had 6 tokens or more. Some of them are lower than others, so some are big while others are very small. 18 terms in this list are common with the terms from the equivalent number of top terms from Zach's earlier corpus study. These are bright, brilliant, clear, dark, deep, expressive, full, heavy, intense, nasal, penetrating, powerful, rich, smooth, soft, sonorous, strong, and warm. So there is definitely considerable overlap between the way these authors talk about individual instruments and the way they talk about instrumental combinations. Here's the same set of words in a table. What we find particularly interesting is that so many of the words that are unique in corpus seem to emphasize combination, comparison, or multiplicity. We interpret 14 terms to fall under this category in alphabetical order. They are background, balanced, blending, colorful, contrasting, dominant, homogeneous, interlocking, prominent, reinforcing, strengthening, supportive, thickening, and transparent. Here are the top 43 terms from the two corpora side by side. And I apologize that the text is so small, but hopefully you can read it. The trend we believe we are observing is that when authors are describing individual timbres, they focus on affect, metaphor, cross-modality, essentially describing the sensorial building blocks of timbre. While some of those characteristics persist in descriptions of instrumental combinations, there may be a shift in emphasis to a more mediated, aesthetically deliberate account of the craft of orchestration, a higher level recognition of artistic function, as opposed to the basic form of timbre perception. It remains to be seen if this trend will persist through other texts, if it will stand up to a more rigorous statistical analysis, and if any comparable perceptual shift may happen in subjects other than the authors of orchestration books. So we don't want to make any very strong claims just yet. We merely want to report our initial observations and intuitions. It is also interesting to consider which combinations authors chose to discuss at all. Of the vast number of possible combinations of instruments of the orchestra, we might expect that some combinations will be discussed very frequently, while others will be discussed rarely or never, reflecting the orchestration practices of composers and perhaps also the aesthetic priorities of the authors. To start with, when we looked at the sheer number of instruments in the combinations that are discussed in these textbooks, about half of the semantic descriptions were applied to generic accounts of multiple instruments with no number specified, such as violins or strings. Those entries that did specify numbers of instruments followed a classic long tail distribution, with descriptions of smaller combinations generally quite a bit higher in tokens and types than those with more. A similar pattern obtains for family representation, with 45% of descriptions referring to only one of the four families of standard orchestral instruments, being strings, woodwinds, and brass, and though it is discussed much less often in this corpus, percussion. And only 4% of entries referred to all four families. In both cases, with families and with number of instruments, the lexical diversity increased as a function of the number of instruments or families involved in the orchestral combination, which is to say that there is more consistency between authors in the terms they chose for smaller combinations than for larger. We might speculate about possible reasons why authors have preferred to discuss smaller combinations, even in books about the symphony orchestra of all things. It might be a manifestation of the un, deux, trois, beaucoup phenomenon that David Huron invokes with reference to perception of polyphonic voice leading. When there are more than three elements in the mix, it is simply much harder for us to disambiguate them. It might be a pedagogical strategy, resting on the assumption that once lower level combinations of two or three have been mastered, the aspiring orchestrator will forge their own creative voice with respect to larger combinations. And it might simply be that the more difficult task is intimidating to authors who might not have an easy way to cope systematically with the exponential complexity of timbres and their semantic associations when many instruments are involved. Here we see the most common descriptors per number of families in the combinations. Again, some of them are the usual suspects of timbre semantics, but we underscore the robust presence of others that refer specifically to collective or emergent properties. As for which particular combinations are discussed the most, authors tend to keep it in the family. As mentioned earlier, entries with an unspecified number of instruments made up about half of the corpus, and 3 of the 5 topmost discussed combinations were generic accounts of strings, woodwinds, and brass. Other highly represented combinations are within family pairings such as viola and cello, oboe and clarinet, and flute and oboe. We still have a very long way to go in teasing apart how particular descriptors relate to particular combinations. But even at a glance, the words used for these families gives a flavor of how these authors conceive of their function within orchestral timbres. With strings described using terms such as homogeneous, rich, light, balanced, and blending, while terms for woodwinds include smooth, diverse, colorful, balanced, and contrasting, and terms for brass include ponderous, deep, balancing, sustaining, and dominating. Analyzing the descriptors in light of the orchestral effects taxonomy reveals interesting asymmetries of distribution as well. Although many perceptual effects can arise from combinations of orchestral instruments, a few seem to be disproportionately represented in this corpus, which may indicate aesthetic priorities of the authors and/or the composers about whose works they were writing. Blend, defined as the fusion of different sources of acoustical information into a more or less unified auditory event, appears to be of singular importance. Although blend is only the 3rd most represented category in this table, timbral augmentation and timbral emergence are subcategories of blend, and timbral heterogeneity is the negation of blend. So 649 tokens, or 50.4% of the corpus, are blend related either positively or negatively. Also emphasized are musical layers and musical lines. Stratification are groupings of events into strata of different prominence, such as foreground, middle ground, and background, accounts for 20.4% of the corpus, and stream segregation, and stream integration, which deal with groupings of sequential events into unitary musical patterns, collectively account for 6.3% of the corpus. Here we see the types with 6 or more tokens for the most represented taxonomic categories. Note the high count for reinforcing and the moderately high count for supportive, which we interpret as functional paraphrases of blend. So to summarize, I reiterate once again that we are in the early stages of this research, but here are our main observations so far. There is substantial overlap, but also substantial difference between the terminology used to describe timbres of individual instruments and timbres arising from instrumental combinations. Small combinations tend to be discussed more frequently than large combinations, both in terms of number of instruments and number of families. Terms that appear more often in reference to instrumental combinations often reflect implicit awareness of perceptual grouping principles in orchestration, especially with reference to blends, layers, and streams. Terms that appear more often in reference to instrumental combinations tend to be more aesthetically mediated, emphasizing the crafts and processes of orchestration as opposed to sensorial and affective features of timbre, which we might think of as the function as opposed to the form of musical timbral experience. For future work, there's a lot, including completing data collection for the remaining orchestration books so that our findings can be compared more directly to those from Wallmark 2019, completing a more thorough statistical analysis of the data, and eventually, we hope, using this corpus analysis as a foundation for future perceptual research. I would like to thank you very much for your attention today. Please feel free to contact us by email or in question period right now. Thanks again to the Actor Project and Stephen McAdams and to our respective institutions and funding agencies. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Jason. So any questions that are popping up, please feel free to raise your hand. I've got a hand from Claudia.
Yeah, thank you very much for this very interesting work. I may have missed something like on slide, I think it's, I don't know, one of the early slides, if you scroll down, where you compare the semantics used for individual instruments compared to orchestral. Maybe, yeah, this one. Could you just remind me the individual instrument descriptors, where did you get them from? Is that from the same treatise and you just look at how they describe individual instruments, or is that from other books?
They are from a larger group of orchestration treatises of which our present corpus is a subset. This is taken directly from Wallmark 2019, which is a corpus of 11 textbooks.
Okay,
and
orchestrational treaties, not from individual like instrumental treaties.
That's right.
Okay, okay. Thanks. Good luck for the rest of the work. It's amazing.
Thank you.
Great. We have a brief request to turn back to the bibliography slide, and also then a question from Eddie.
Hi, Jason. Thanks for the talk. I was curious, would you consider, since some books do provide audio examples, either within the book or references in recordings, whether you would consider doing some sort of acoustic analysis on the examples that accompany these verbal descriptors, and then do some sort of analysis, let's say, as in Asterios research, to combine verbal descriptors with audio descriptors, or even use non-standard descriptors such as Sven's work to perhaps explain the amount of blend?
I think that's a brilliant idea, and we definitely should do that. Like the Adler in particular has a lot of sound examples that comes with it. maybe that's my go-to because it's the one that I studied with and the one that I use the most, but it has loads of sound examples, both for individual instruments and for the combinations that we're interested in seeing. It would be fabulous to do an acoustical analysis of those sounds and compare them to the semantics that are reported.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Great, thanks. Question from Natalie.
Yes, many thanks, Jason, for this paper. A small question about the languages of the treatises, and did you have difficulties related to translations, or what were the languages involved in your study?
Right, excellent question. Well, they're all listed here in the bibliography. I actually don't know for sure if they were all originally written in English. I think that they were, but correct me if I'm wrong about that, Zach. But we were only looking at English textbooks for now, but that is a very important point. We really ought to branch out and look at other treatises. I'm sure there's plenty in German and French and various other languages.
Yes, I agree. That would be a very fun project that I would be interested in doing too. Let's do it. Okay, so I have a question. What was the most common combination of instruments that was described? And if it was combinations of strings, what was the not string combination?
Right. So flute and oboe and just let me bring it up. Actually, I've got it right here. Strings was top, woodwinds was second, strings, woodwinds, and brass was third. So I assume that that's kind of where they're talking about tutti textures. The top one where we're getting into specific instruments as opposed to families is viola and cello. Then we have brass, then we have woodwinds and strings. Then it's oboe and clarinet, which you might be happy to know, Lindsay, as an oboist yourself. Then we have flute and oboe, and then for the first time, I guess we have specific combinations of instruments across families down at number 9, with only 8 instances as compared with 33 for strings altogether. And the further down you get on the list, the more we start seeing big idiosyncratic pairings, you know, I'm pretty sure the reason that they're there is like this one, for example. What have we got? Piccolo, flute, oboe, bassoon, a clarinet, horn, harp, and strings. I assume that that particular combination is there because there was an instance in the repertoire that the author wanted to talk about. And so the example determined the combination. Whereas when you're closer to the top, I think they just figure that combinations of flute and oboe, for example, are common enough across the repertoire that it needs to be discussed across multiple examples.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, that's intriguing. Great. Any other questions for Kit, Jason, and Zach? We have 5 minutes, so we can go back to Peter had a question for Mo.
Mm-hmm.
So shall we do that? Peter, are you still interested in asking your question? The question is syntax more than simply that there is a structure of near-far perceptual similarity distance in timbral space? Oh, you're muted.
There we go. It's a great question. It would serve to reformulate the debate. I mean, to ask that question actually shifts the entire debate onto grounds that I don't think it's been considered under. Maybe it's a really interesting proposition. Could there be another factor that is determining some syntax? It's possible. One of the, I guess one of the barriers to that is that we can't point to anything that feels like a syntax yet. And what I mean there is if we think about what syntax means in language, it's very easy to put up a sentence on a slide, point to it, and demonstrate the syntax. When we talk about harmony, so long as you have a very basic knowledge of tonal harmony, it's quite easy to abstract away from it and point to a syntax that makes sense. But to date, there's no similar way of pointing to timbre and saying, see, it's so immediate. Whereas it's quite immediate in other forms of syntax. So it's possible, and I suppose it might sound like I was saying that it's impossible to have a syntax, and that's not what I was saying at all. I was saying that we haven't found one yet, and maybe that means there isn't one. Maybe it just means it's incredibly difficult. But I would think that a condition of syntax would, a condition for syntax would be that it's easy, that it's obvious in some sense, and it doesn't seem to be obvious at the present moment. That could change, and I'd be very open to it. Interesting question.
Yeah, very intriguing. Thanks. Well, we'll stop there. And Matt had one more question, but I think that he'll probably, you might have a question for him on his presentation, because it sounds like you guys, we would have a lot of neat stuff to talk about, I think. But I'll leave that for the next session, or maybe later.
Yeah, I would say wonderful, but I would just hop on while we're specifically on syntax, because I'm not going to bring up syntax in my talk this afternoon. That the relationship between syntax and musical logic is something that we should consider, and that syntax is a system that's transferable from piece to piece, and that it's a system separate from the piece of music that we are actually talking about, whereas musical logic is developed within the piece, and it is the musical logic of the piece. So we'll discuss that a little bit more this afternoon. I don't want to dig into everyone's time, but Mo, I'd love, we can talk about it more sometime. Just to make sure, that we're, a syntax is a system external to the music we're listening to, and like tonality. If you're working on, listening to a tonal piece, tonality exists by itself, and the system, the relations that are created with timbre compositionally from a musical standpoint don't have that same sort of system. But they certainly have a system, within pieces.
I agree on both counts, and I very much look forward to your talk and to talking with you privately after about
Absolutely, yeah.
Great, that brings us right to time, and I'm glad we did enjoy that little extra wiggle room we had. So thank you, and back to the conference hosts.
So thank you, Lindsay, Jason, and